There are moments in life when someone's silence cuts deeper than the loudest argument. It was the kind of silence that builds between two people not because of words spoken, but because of the words that never came. And for the first time in a long time, I felt completely alone in my own problems. I had just lost my job. The cafe where I'd worked for almost 3 years had closed down unexpectedly. No warning, no soft landing. One day I was pouring coffee. The next I was standing in my small kitchen staring at the bills piling up on the table, trying to breathe through the panic sitting heavy on my chest. Rent was due at the end of the week, and my savings were a joke. Enough to maybe cover groceries and gas if I was lucky. We weren't married, my boyfriend and I. We didn't even live together. That was his idea, not mine. He liked his space. Said it was healthy to have boundaries. But after a few years of hearing that word, it started to feel like just another wall between us. And yet, despite the distance, despite how often I had to remind myself that we weren't building a life together, but simply orbiting each other's, I still called him first. I didn't even get 2 sentences in before he cut me off. "Well, you'll figure it out," he said, like I was asking for the weather forecast instead of telling him I couldn't pay my rent. "You always do." I swallowed so hard it hurt. "I just thought maybe you could help me this month. I wouldn't—" "Look," he sighed, and I could hear the tapping of his fingers against something, distracted. "It's not really my responsibility, is it? I mean, you're independent. You always say so." I wanted to scream, not because he was wrong, but because he was using my own words against me. I was independent. I had always prided myself on that. But there's a difference between being independent and being left to drown alone. The call ended with one of those awkward pauses where neither of us really knew how to close the conversation. He mumbled something like, "Take care," before hanging up. I stood there for a long time after, phone still pressed to my ear even though the line had gone dead. The apartment felt colder that night, empty in a way that had nothing to do with the furniture. I sat on the floor by the window, knees pulled tight to my chest, watching the streetlights blink on one by one. The city outside kept moving, as if my small collapse didn't matter at all. It was late when I heard the knock at the door. Not frantic, not impatient, just steady. I wiped my face with the sleeve of my sweater and pulled myself off the floor. When I opened the door, there he was. My landlord. He was always polite. Courteous in that way older men sometimes are, as though they know their presence takes up more space than it should. Tall, broad-shouldered, with dark skin that caught the light and eyes that seemed to notice more than they let on. His voice was always calm, measured. He never raised it. "Sorry to bother you this late," he said, nodding once. "Just following up on the rent situation." The words made my stomach drop. I must have looked like hell. Red eyes, messy hair, still in the oversized sweater I'd thrown on that morning because I couldn't bring myself to care. "I know the deadline's coming," I managed to say, my throat tight. I lost my job." There was a pause. Not the uncomfortable kind, but the kind where the other person is actually listening. He didn't rush to fill the silence. He just nodded again, slower this time. "That's rough," he said. "I'm sorry to hear it." I could feel the heat rise up my neck, humiliation burning through me. I hated how small I felt, how obvious my situation must have looked. "I'll figure it out," I blurted. I need a little time." His gaze didn't shift. He didn't cross his arms or lean on the doorframe like some men do when they're about to lay down the law. He just stood there, grounded, steady. "I'm not here to pressure you," he said softly. "But if you need to talk about options, my office is open. Come by tomorrow if you'd like." Options. The word echoed in my head long after he left. I didn't know what exactly he meant. I wasn't sure if I wanted to find out. But when the door closed behind him and I slid back down onto the floor, burying my face into my hands, one thought pressed itself into my mind and refused to leave. I couldn't count on the person I loved. And maybe, just maybe, I wasn't as independent as I'd always told myself. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed awake, eyes tracing the cracks in the ceiling, the faint hum of the refrigerator filling the silence like a steady, unforgiving metronome. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard his voice again. Not my landlord's, but my boyfriend's. Those few simple words so casually thrown at me, clanging like loose change in an empty jar. You'll figure it out. As if that was enough. As if that was what support sounded like. By morning, the ache in my chest had settled into something colder, sharper. I moved through the motions of the day because I had to, not because I wanted to. Took a shower without feeling the water. Got dressed without caring much what I put on. Jeans, an old t-shirt. Hair pulled back loosely, barely touched with a brush. I looked tired, and the mirror didn't lie. The notice on my fridge about the rent deadline stared at me like a quiet threat. I hated that it made my hands tremble when I looked at it. Hated that the thought of calling my boyfriend again to ask for help felt so impossible. So humiliating. But most of all, I hated the sinking feeling that the conversation wouldn't go any differently than it had the night before. I didn't plan to go to my landlord's office. I told myself I wouldn't. I told myself I'd figure it out on my own, just like everyone seemed to expect me to. But somewhere between pacing my apartment and checking my bank account for the third time, I found myself putting on lipstick. Not bright, barely noticeable. Just enough to make me feel like I was at least trying. I changed my shirt twice before leaving the apartment. Simple clothes, nothing that suggested I cared too much about how I looked. But the truth was, I did care. I cared more than I wanted to admit. His office was just a few blocks away, tucked behind a small row of shops. I'd walked past it dozens of times, never needing to go inside before. The door was open, soft music playing quietly from a radio on the desk. He was there, seated behind a cluttered workspace, reading through a stack of papers. When he looked up and saw me standing there, he didn't smile right away. He just nodded, motioned for me to come in. "You made it," he said, voice low and even. I nodded, my throat too tight for a proper reply. I sat down across from him, feeling like I was 12 years old again, waiting to be scolded by a teacher for not turning in my homework on time. "I'm sorry to just show up," I said finally, the words feeling heavier than they should have been. He leaned back slightly, resting his hands on the arms of his chair, eyes on me, calm, patient. "I told you you're welcome anytime." I looked down at my hands, fingers knotting together in my lap. I didn't want to cry. I'd already done enough of that the night before. "I lost my job," I repeated, though he already knew. I really don't have the rent this month. Not even part of it." The words tasted like failure, like defeat. I hated how they sounded, but they were the truth. He nodded slowly, still watching me with that same quiet focus. No judgment in his expression, just listening. "I appreciate you being honest with me," he said after a moment. "Most people don't even do that." There was another pause between us, the kind that stretched long enough to feel heavy but not uncomfortable. More like he was giving me space to say more if I wanted to. "I've been looking for work," I added quickly, my voice a little too defensive. "I'm not just sitting around waiting for help." "I didn't assume you were," he answered gently. I could feel the heat creeping up the back of my neck again, a familiar wave of shame that I couldn't quite keep down. I hated being here like this. Hated needing help at all. "I don't expect you to give me a free pass," I said, struggling to keep my tone steady. "I know that's not how this works." He didn't argue. He didn't make me feel worse than I already did. Instead, he leaned forward just slightly, folding his hands together on the desk between us. "What if we found a different way to handle it?" he asked, voice soft. I blinked, unsure what he meant. The words hung there, not suggestive, not loaded, just open. But there was something in the way he said them. Something deliberate. Controlled. "I'm listening," I replied, though I could already feel the tension start to build inside my chest. He didn't say anything at first. He just held my gaze. Calm, steady, but with that hint of curiosity. The kind that waits, that lets you fill the space yourself. There's no pressure, he said finally. I'm not asking for anything you don't want to give, but you and I both know the situation you're in. If you'd be willing, maybe we could work out a private arrangement between us. The room felt smaller all of a sudden, the air thicker. His words weren't vulgar. They weren't even explicit. But I understood him perfectly. I didn't speak right away. I couldn't. My mind was racing too fast, trying to make sense of the ground shifting under my feet. You mean, I started, but my voice caught before I could finish. He nodded once, slowly. Only if it's something you'd consider, he said. If not, the door's still open. You have my word. I sat there frozen for what felt like forever, heart pounding so loud I was sure he could hear it. I should have gotten up. I should have walked out. But I didn't. I stayed. And when I finally did stand, my legs felt unsteady beneath me. I moved toward the door, but before I reached it, I stopped, my hand on the frame. I turned to look at him one last time, unsure of what I was searching for in his expression. But all I saw was that same calm, steady patience. The space he was giving me to make my own decision. I left without saying anything else. But my body was still humming from the charge of that conversation, and deep down, I knew I would be back. The air outside felt colder than it should have for that time of year. Or maybe it was just me, walking home with my thoughts too loud to notice anything else. The streets blurred around me, cars passing by, people living their lives. None of it seemed real. I wasn't even sure how I made it back to my apartment. I unlocked the door mechanically, dropped my keys onto the counter, and stood there in the middle of the room like I didn't recognize the place. It's a strange thing, the way a single conversation can rearrange the entire shape of your mind. I kept going over it, again and again, hearing his voice, feeling the weight of his words settle into my chest. Maybe we could work out a private arrangement. Nothing forceful, nothing ugly, just quiet, deliberate possibility. I told myself that I should be angry. I told myself I should feel disgusted, humiliated, offended. But the truth that I couldn't run from, no matter how hard I tried, was that I didn't feel any of those things. I felt seen, and I hated myself for that. The worst part wasn't the offer itself. The worst part was how easily I could picture saying yes. I spent the next 2 days avoiding my phone like it might bite me. I didn't call my boyfriend. He didn't call me either. There was no sudden concern from him, no check-in, no follow-up to the conversation we'd had that night. He'd already moved on. I was sure of it. Back to his schedule, his meetings, his world where I was just an accessory he could put down when things got too heavy. And yet, there was a small part of me, the stupid, hopeful part, that waited for him to call anyway. Some pathetic flicker of belief that he might surprise me, might do the thing I had been too afraid to ask for, to care enough to show up. But the silence from him was louder than any words. By the third day, the rent deadline was staring me down like an executioner. The number circled in red on my calendar felt childish now, as if highlighting it would somehow make it less real. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at it, knowing exactly how little was sitting in my bank account. I wasn't the kind of person who asked for help easily. I'd built my whole life around the idea that I didn't need to. And yet, here I was, painted into a corner, my pride clinging to me like wet clothes I couldn't peel off. I almost didn't send the message. My thumb hovered over the keyboard for a long time. I typed out half a dozen drafts, deleting each one before my nerves could get the better of me. When I finally hit send, the text was so short it felt like a betrayal of how much turmoil was behind it. "Can we talk again?" He responded quickly. Just 2 words, simple and unassuming. "Come by." I read those words over and over, each time feeling a different wave of panic and relief wash through me. The sun was starting to set when I finally left my apartment. The walk to his office felt longer than it had the first time. Every step felt like I was walking towards something I couldn't quite name, but already knew I wouldn't be able to turn away from. When I pushed the door open, the room was quiet. The same soft music hummed from the radio. He was at his desk again, leaning back in his chair like he'd been waiting all along. He didn't stand when I entered, didn't greet me with any false enthusiasm, just nodded toward the chair across from him, the same way he had before. I sat down slowly, unsure how to even begin. "I'm not here to make this uncomfortable," he said, breaking the silence after a long pause. "If you changed your mind, I understand." I swallowed hard. My hands were clasped tightly in my lap, fingers twisting together until the knuckles ached. I could barely look at him. "I don't know what I'm doing," I admitted, my voice quieter than I meant it to be. He leaned forward, elbows resting on the desk, hands folded. His expression stayed calm, open, giving me room to say whatever I needed to. "I'm not going to ask you for details you're not ready to share," he said softly. "But I'll tell you this. I respect the fact that you came here. Whatever you decide, I'll respect that too." His words landed differently than I expected. There was no rush, no pressure behind them, just patience. I let out a slow breath, forcing myself to meet his gaze. "I need time," I said finally. "You have it," he replied. It should have felt like the end of the conversation, but I didn't move. Neither did he. The space between us held something thick and unspoken. A quiet understanding neither of us tried to name out loud. "I didn't think it would ever come to this," I murmured, not even sure if I was talking to him or myself. "Most people don't," he said. I hated how steady his voice was, how measured, like he'd seen this before, like he understood it better than I ever could. There was a long pause, heavy but not uncomfortable. I could feel his eyes on me, but not in a way that made my skin crawl. It was worse than that. It made me feel like he actually saw me. Not just the broke tenant sitting across from him, but the whole exhausted, frayed, quietly desperate person I'd been trying so hard to keep together. I stood up slowly, my hands still shaking more than I wanted them to. "I'll let you know," I said. He nodded once, saying nothing more, letting me have the last word without contest. But as I turned to leave, I felt his eyes following me to the door. And for the first time, I didn't hate the way it felt. I hated that I didn't hate it at all. I thought that walking away from that conversation would bring me some sense of clarity, some relief for having held my ground, for not giving in so easily to what was offered between the lines. But clarity didn't come. What came instead was a weight in my chest that only grew heavier with each hour that passed. I couldn't stop replaying the scene in my head, couldn't stop dissecting every word, every look, every pause between the two of us. The truth was that I had already crossed a line the moment I didn't shut the door on the idea. I spent the next few days trying to bury myself in whatever distractions I could find. I filled out job applications like it was my full-time occupation now, scrolling endlessly through listings that all started to blur together. Waitressing, reception work, retail, anything that could buy me a little time. But the responses, when they came at all, were polite rejections, generic apologies wrapped in corporate language, positions filled. Not what we're looking for at this time. Best of luck in your search. Every no chipped away at my resolve a little more. The apartment felt smaller each day. The walls seemed to lean in closer, as if they were tired of hearing me pace the floor, tired of watching me spiral in circles that led nowhere. The unopened bills stacked on the counter became harder to ignore. The red ink on the rent notice glared at me from across the room like an accusation. And still, silence from my boyfriend. No calls, no check-ins, not even a casual text to ask how I was holding up. The first few days, I told myself he was giving me space, that maybe he thought I needed time to figure things out on my own. But as the week dragged on, it became harder to believe that. The space between us wasn't temporary. It was structural, built in. A feature, not a flaw. I started to notice things I hadn't wanted to admit before. How often our conversations were about his life, his work, his stresses. How rarely he asked about mine. How easily he dismissed my worries with quick platitudes, as if kindness were something he rationed carefully, reserved only for crises that fit neatly into his comfort zone. Financial problems apparently didn't qualify. The more I sat with that realization, the angrier I became. Not at him, or not only at him, but at myself. For holding on so tightly to the idea of what we were supposed to be. For waiting, always waiting, for him to meet me halfway. It was on the fourth night, sitting cross-legged on the floor with a bowl of cereal I didn't have the appetite to finish, that my phone lit up. Not from him. Not the message I had been pretending I wasn't hoping for. It was from my landlord. Hope you're doing okay. Just checking in. 7 simple words, nothing dramatic, nothing suggestive. But they cracked something open in me that I'd been holding closed with both hands. The kindness of it. The simple act of someone asking how I was without following it up with judgment or advice. It knocked the air right out of me. I didn't respond right away. I stared at the message for a long time, rereading it until the words blurred together. My fingers hovered over the keyboard more than once, typing and deleting a dozen different replies. When I finally answered, it wasn't with anything clever or defensive. Just the truth. I'm not doing great. His reply came quickly. If you want to talk, I'm here. There was no flirtation in it, no pressure, just an open door, waiting. I don't know what I was expecting when I put on my shoes and grabbed my jacket. I told myself I was just going to clear my head. A walk? Nothing more. But my feet knew where they were going before my brain caught up. I didn't even hesitate when I reached his office. The lights were still on. The soft glow spilling out onto the sidewalk made the place feel warmer than it had any right to. I stood outside for longer than I should have, hands stuffed deep into my pockets, willing myself to turn around and go back home. But my body stayed rooted in place. And after a while, as if he'd sensed me through the walls, the door opened. He didn't look surprised to see me. Come in, he said quietly. I stepped inside, my heartbeat loud enough in my ears that I was sure he could hear it. The room smelled faintly of coffee and old wood. The same music played softly from the radio, filling the space between us with a kind of ease I wasn't sure I deserved to feel. I stayed standing, not trusting myself to sit down. I didn't come here for... I started, but the words felt too heavy to finish. He nodded once, slowly. I know. There was a moment, brief but undeniable, when our eyes met and something passed between us. Recognition. Understanding. Whatever it was, it made my throat tighten so hard I could barely swallow. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I'm just tired, I admitted. Then sit, he said, motioning toward the chair across from him. I did. Slowly, carefully. Like the act of sitting down might somehow make everything more real. We didn't speak for a while after that. The silence between us wasn't awkward. It was something closer to permission, space to breathe. I meant what I said before. He offered eventually. I'm not going to pressure you. Whatever happens here, it's your choice. I nodded, my eyes fixed on the floor. I didn't trust myself to look at him. But in the quiet that followed, I felt the weight of his attention on me. Not invasive, not demanding. Just there. And in that moment, I realized how long it had been since anyone had looked at me like that. There's a certain kind of quiet that doesn't ask for words. The kind that settles between two people when everything that needs to be said already hangs in the air, waiting. That was the quiet that filled the room as I sat there across from him, my hands gripping the edge of the chair like it might keep me from floating away. I told myself I was only here because I needed to talk. Because I needed someone to hear me. Really hear me without the loaded weight of expectation. But that wasn't the whole truth. I had crossed a different line the moment I opened that door, the moment I walked into his office with more than just words sitting heavy on my tongue. He watched me the way someone watches a fire they're not sure they should put out. Calm, steady, aware of the danger but unwilling to turn away. I wanted to tell him no. I wanted to say I wasn't that kind of woman, that I wasn't capable of doing the thing we were both circling so slowly. But the truth sat too loud in my chest to ignore. I was tired of holding myself together, tired of pretending that strength meant isolation, tired of waiting for someone else to decide if I was worth showing up for. When I finally raised my eyes to meet his, I didn't flinch. I didn't apologize. I let the silence speak for me. He stood, moving with the same quiet confidence I had come to recognize in him, and crossed the small space between us. There was no urgency in his steps, no rush to close the distance. He paused when he reached me, standing just close enough that I could feel the heat of his body without him having to touch me. Still, he waited, always waiting, giving me the space to choose. I didn't say yes. I didn't have to. I reached up first, my fingers brushing lightly against the fabric of his sleeve, feeling the solidity of him beneath it. That small, deliberate act was all it took to break the last piece of resistance inside me. I stood, slow, careful, my body moving before my mind could talk me out of it. There was a moment, a single heartbeat of hesitation, where I could have stepped back. I could have told myself that this was just a bad idea born out of desperation. But I didn't. Instead, I closed the space between us, leaning in, pressing my lips to his. It wasn't soft. It wasn't tentative. It was hungry in the way that only loneliness can be. His hands rose, one resting against the small of my back, the other gently cupping the side of my face, steadying me as if I might fall. But I wasn't falling. I was choosing to be wanted, to be touched, to be something more than the independent woman barely holding herself together. The kiss deepened, but there was no rush, no frantic clawing or grabbing. Only deliberate movements, slow and measured, like he knew exactly how dangerous this was and wasn't afraid to take his time with the fire. When we finally parted, it wasn't with shame. It wasn't with regret. I didn't look away from him. I held his gaze, breathless, heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my fingertips. His eyes searched mine, waiting again, always waiting. But this time I spoke. "I don't know what this makes me," I whispered. His hand moved to my chin, gentle, lifting my face toward him. "It makes you human." I should have cried. I should have felt broken or dirty or ashamed, but I didn't. All I felt was the strange relief of being seen, really seen. The way he looked at me, not like a failure, not like a problem to be solved, but as a woman who had needs and wants that didn't make her weak. They made her real. When I left his office that night, I didn't run. I didn't sneak out like someone carrying a secret they couldn't bear to own. I walked, steady, my head high, the weight of my choice sitting heavy but certain on my shoulders. But the moment I stepped back into my apartment, the silence felt different. Heavier somehow. The place that had felt so suffocating before now felt too big, too empty. I sat on the edge of my bed, my fingers running over my lips like I could still feel the shape of his kiss there. I didn't call my boyfriend. I didn't want to hear his voice right then. Didn't want the sound of his indifference to replace the memory of someone who had actually listened. The next morning came too fast. The sunlight creeping through the blinds felt unforgiving. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, the ache in my chest familiar but sharper now. I knew this wasn't over. Not yet. Because as much as I wanted to tell myself that one kiss was the end of it, that it was just a moment of weakness, an accident, the truth lived deeper than that. I wanted to feel it again. The body remembers what the mind tries so hard to bury. It remembers the warmth of hands where they don't belong, the press of lips against skin that wasn't supposed to be touched. It remembers the weight of wanting, the sharp clarity of being desired. And no matter how many times I told myself that it had been just a mistake, just a momentary lapse, my body refused to believe me. The days that followed weren't marked by any grand decision. There was no sudden shift, no dramatic confrontation with myself in the mirror. I didn't fall to my knees, sobbing with regret. Instead, everything became quiet. Too quiet. A dull hum beneath the surface of every ordinary thing I did. I answered calls, smiled politely at neighbors, kept up the small charade of routine. But my mind wandered. My thoughts kept circling back to the heat of that kiss, to the way he had held my face so gently, as if I might shatter if he pushed too hard. That patience, that steady control, it had burrowed deep beneath my skin, and no amount of pretending could dislodge it. I didn't tell my boyfriend. The distance between us had already grown so wide it felt like one more thing lost in the space where we used to talk. And he didn't notice. Or if he did, he didn't care enough to ask. Our last conversation had been as brief and detached as the others before it. I had mentioned offhandedly that I was still looking for work. His only reply had been the familiar, half-hearted reassurance that something would come along. Not an offer to help. Not even a question about how I was holding up. Just those same tired words, spoken like a line he'd rehearsed too many times to mean. It shouldn't have surprised me. And yet it still did. Somewhere beneath my anger and disappointment, I kept hoping he would wake up. That he would see me standing there, trying so hard to hold it all together, and realize how close I was to breaking. But he didn't. And the longer the silence stretched between us, the louder another voice grew inside me. The one that kept reminding me how it felt to be wanted. To be seen. I thought about texting my landlord more times than I could count. My thumb hovered over his name on my phone so many nights, tracing the letters as if they held some kind of answer. But I didn't reach out. Not at first. It was a chance encounter that broke the standoff. I was coming back from the grocery store, my arms heavy with bags I could barely carry when I saw him outside the building. He was working on the front steps, fixing one of the loose railings that had been wobbling for weeks. The sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the pavement. And for a moment, I just stood there watching him. He looked up and caught my eye before I could turn away. "Need a hand?" he asked. I opened my mouth to decline, the instinctive refusal ready on my tongue, but I didn't use it. Instead, I nodded once and he stepped forward, taking the bags from my arms with the same calm ease he brought to everything else. I followed him up the stairs, the weight of the groceries replaced by something much heavier in my chest. Inside my apartment, I set the keys on the counter and turned to thank him, but the words tangled somewhere in my throat. "You holding up okay?" he asked softly. It was such a simple question, one that shouldn't have mattered, but no one else had asked. Not like that. Not with eyes that actually wanted to know the answer. I felt the sting behind my eyes before I could stop it. "I'm fine," I lied, my voice too thin to believe. He didn't call me on it. Didn't push. He just nodded once, his gaze steady on mine. There was a long pause. One of those moments where the silence says more than any words could. I didn't know if it was my loneliness that moved me closer, or my pride finally crumbling under the weight of it all. But when I stepped toward him, I didn't stop. And when he didn't move away, I knew he wouldn't. The kiss this time wasn't frantic. It wasn't hungry. It was slow, deliberate, the kind of kiss that asks a question and waits for the answer to come back. His hands were careful, tracing the line of my jaw, the curve of my waist, as if he needed to memorize the shape of me. I let myself lean into it, let myself feel the way his touch softened the ache in my chest. Even as it deepened, the guilt curled tight inside my stomach. When I pulled back, breathless, I didn't look away. "I shouldn't be here," I whispered, though we both knew it was a lie. I was exactly where I wanted to be. He didn't argue. He didn't try to convince me otherwise. He just watched me, quiet, patient, the same way he always did. "I know," he said. And somehow that made it worse, because the truth was, he wasn't the one chasing this. I was. The choice had been mine all along. There's something dangerous about feeling wanted when you've spent too long feeling invisible. It sinks into your skin, fills the hollow places you've learned to ignore, and makes a home there. I kept telling myself that I still had control, that this wasn't what it looked like. But control is a funny thing. You think you're holding the reins, but by the time you realize they've slipped from your hands, the damage is already done. After that night, I didn't hear from him. No calls, no texts, no cryptic messages waiting on my phone. He didn't show up at my door. He didn't need to. The silence itself became the hook, pulling me closer with every day that passed. The longer he stayed quiet, the louder the need inside me grew. It surprised me how much I wanted him to reach out, to chase me, to break the distance. But he didn't. And the absence of pressure made it worse. He knew exactly what he was doing. I lasted 3 days before I broke the quiet myself. The message I sent him was brief, simple, just one line that felt heavier than it should have. "Are you home?" The reply didn't come right away. It came hours later, just as the sun began to fall beneath the edge of the horizon, casting the sky in soft bruises of purple and blue. His answer was as quiet as the question. Yes. There were no promises, no invitations. Just the word, left sitting there, daring me to decide what to do next. I waited another hour before I let myself move. I told myself again and again that I wouldn't go, that I was better than this, stronger than this. But the lie wore thin in my hands, and soon it crumbled altogether. I left my apartment without thinking too much about what I was wearing. Simple jeans, a fitted black top that clung a little too tightly to my skin, sleeves pushed up just enough to bare my forearms. I told myself it didn't matter. I wasn't dressing for him. I wasn't dressing for anyone. But I caught my reflection in the window as I passed by, and even I couldn't believe the lie. The walk to his place felt longer than it should have. Each step measured, deliberate, like the weight of my choice pressed down on my shoulders, slowing me. But I didn't stop. When I reached the door, I stood there for a long moment, my fist raised halfway to knock, frozen in place. The apartment complex was quiet, the soft buzz of the city distant enough to make the moment feel suspended in air. I almost turned back. Almost. But the door opened before I had the chance. He stood there, leaning lightly against the frame, arms crossed loosely over his chest. No smile, no smirk. Just those steady eyes watching me, waiting for me to make the first move. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said. I didn't answer right away. I didn't trust my voice to sound like it belonged to me. "I wasn't sure either," I replied finally. The space between us felt too small and too wide at the same time. He stepped back, opening the door further, and I crossed the threshold before I could talk myself out of it. The apartment was dimly lit, the faint glow of a single lamp in the corner washing the room in soft gold. It smelled faintly of cedar and something richer beneath it, a scent I couldn't name but recognized as his. I stood there awkwardly, unsure where to put my hands, unsure whether I should sit or stay standing, but he didn't rush me. He never did. Instead, he walked past me, moving into the kitchen, his steps unhurried. "Coffee?" he asked, as if this were the most ordinary conversation in the world. I shook my head before realizing how absurd that felt. "No," I said, the word catching against my throat. He poured himself a cup anyway, leaning against the counter, sipping slowly, his eyes never leaving mine. The quiet between us stretched long enough that I felt it in my bones. "I shouldn't be here," I said, my voice lower now. His reply was as calm as ever. "I know." The words hit harder than I wanted them to. There was no seduction in them, no plea, only fact. And that was what made my knees weaken beneath me. Because he wasn't asking for this. He wasn't pushing. He was simply giving me the space to want it enough to cross the line myself. I sat down on the edge of his couch, my hands clenched so tightly in my lap that my knuckles ached. I stared down at them, my heart racing, every part of me screaming to either leave or close the space between us. But neither of us moved first. It was me. Always me. I stood, slowly, my legs feeling too heavy beneath me, and crossed the room toward him. He didn't back away, didn't lean in, just waited. I reached out, my hand brushing lightly against his chest, feeling the slow, steady rhythm of his breath beneath my palm. And when I looked up at him, his eyes were the same as they had been every time before. Patient, watching, holding the space open for me to decide. There was no question left between us. When I kissed him, it wasn't desperate. It wasn't frantic, it was deliberate. A choice. My choice. And this time, when his hands found my waist, pulling me closer, I didn't flinch. I leaned into the heat of him, letting the softness of his mouth steal the last of my restraint. My fingers threaded into the fabric of his shirt, holding tight, grounding myself against the weight of the decision I was making. There were no words between us after that. None were needed. When I finally pulled away, breathless, my lips swollen from the press of his, I met his eyes and held them. I didn't apologize, because the truth was, I didn't regret it. Not even a little. I told myself that after that night, I would keep my distance. That I would find the strength to draw the line again, to remind myself of what I wasn't supposed to be. But the body has its own memory, its own language. And no matter how many times I rehearsed my guilt, no matter how many ways I framed it in my head as wrong, my body wouldn't forget how it felt to be touched like that. To be wanted without question, without conditions, without apology. I didn't wake up the next morning in his apartment. I didn't stay. I left before the first light reached the windows, the quiet stillness of the early hour pressing against my back as I closed the door behind me. The walk home was slow, my head spinning in that strange, numb fog where shame and satisfaction bleed together, each one fighting for space. I didn't cry. I thought I might. But the tears never came. Instead, there was only that hollow ache beneath my ribs, the place where self-respect was supposed to sit. I kept waiting for the regret to crash down on me, to drown me in the weight of it. But it didn't. The regret stayed distant, abstract, a thing I told myself I should feel, but didn't. I showered as soon as I got home, stood under the water until my skin turned raw from the heat, scrubbing at myself as if that could erase the memory of his hands, his mouth, the sound of my own breath catching in my throat. But nothing washed it away. It was there, under my skin, stitched into the fabric of me now. When my phone buzzed later that morning, my heart jumped before I even saw the screen. I expected it to be him, though I wasn't sure what I thought he might say. But it wasn't. It was my boyfriend. A casual text, light and easy, as if everything between us was still intact. Hey, how's the job hunt going? Any luck yet? No mention of how quiet I'd been. No question about how I was really doing. Just the same polite check-in, detached and distant, as though I were a colleague he hadn't seen in a while. Not the woman he was supposed to love. I stared at the message, my thumb hovering over the reply. There were so many things I wanted to say. To scream. To throw at him like stones. Where were you when I needed you? Did you even notice how close I was to breaking? Do you care at all that I've been drowning right in front of you? But I typed out the same lie I'd been telling him for weeks. Still looking. I'm fine. And when he replied with, "You'll get there. I believe in you," I felt something inside me snap so quietly, I almost missed the sound. Belief is easy when it costs nothing. The next few days moved slowly, the hours stretching out longer than they should have. Every task feeling heavier, every breath sharp against the hollow space inside me. I didn't reach out to my landlord. He didn't reach out to me. But the silence between us wasn't empty. It buzzed beneath my skin like static. I caught myself thinking about him too often. Wondering what he was doing. Wondering if he was thinking about me. And with every thought, the guilt would rise in my throat, thick and bitter, only to settle back down again when I reminded myself that my boyfriend had stopped seeing me long before I'd let anyone else look. It was late on a Wednesday evening when the silence finally broke. I had spent the day walking aimlessly through the city, filling out more applications, answering automated emails, going through the motions of hope without any real conviction. By the time I got home, my feet ached, my head throbbed, and my will was worn down thin. There was a knock at my door. Not loud, not urgent, just a soft, steady rhythm that made my heart catch. I froze, staring at the door, my breath shallow. I knew it was him. Before I moved, before I checked, I knew. When I opened the door, he stood there the same way he always did. Calm, collected, patient. He didn't step inside, didn't lean in, just stood there, hands in his pockets, eyes on mine. "I wanted to make sure you're okay," he said, his voice low. I hated how much those words undid me, how easily they cracked the thin armor I'd spent the last few days trying to hold together. It was such a small thing, asking if I was okay. And yet it felt like the first real kindness I'd been shown in weeks. I didn't invite him in. I stepped outside instead, closing the door gently behind me as if that would somehow keep the line between us intact. We stood there in the quiet of the hallway, the air thick between us, the space too small for the weight of what we weren't saying. I crossed my arms over my chest, more to hold myself together than for warmth. "I'm fine," I said, the lie thin and cracking at the edges. His eyes didn't waver. He didn't call me out. Just let the words hang there between us, heavy with the truth they didn't hold. I should have walked away. I should have thanked him, turned around, and gone back into my apartment. But I didn't. I stood there, frozen by the gravity of his presence, by the softness of his gaze, by the ache that had been building inside me for so long. When he stepped closer, it wasn't aggressive. It wasn't even assertive. It was slow, deliberate, leaving room for me to pull away if I wanted to. But I didn't move. And when his hand reached out, fingers brushing lightly against the curve of my jaw, I leaned into the touch without even meaning to. It was my choice. Again. The kiss came soft this time. No hunger, no desperation. Just heat and quiet understanding. A gentle press of lips that felt more like a question than a statement. I kissed him back anyway. And when I finally pulled away, eyes still closed, breath shallow, the only thing I could think was how easy it had been to let it happen again. Easier than it ever should have been. I wish I could tell you that was the last time. That the kiss we shared in the dim hallway of my building was the final mistake, the moment I came to my senses and pulled myself back from the edge. But that would be a lie. The truth was far less dramatic and much harder to swallow. I didn't want to stop. Not really. Not in the way that mattered. I kept telling myself that I was still in control, that every step I took toward him was a conscious choice I could just as easily undo. But choices like these have a way of chaining themselves together, each one making the next harder to resist. And by the time you realize how far you've wandered, the path back has already disappeared behind you. In the days that followed, my thoughts became a constant war zone. Every quiet moment turned into a courtroom where I was both the accused and the jury, endlessly cycling through justifications and self-condemnation. But for all my internal arguments, for all my rehearsed guilt, I couldn't deny the deeper pull beneath it all, the part of me that had been waiting so long for something to feel this alive. The hardest thing to admit wasn't that I had cheated. It wasn't even the betrayal itself. The hardest thing was understanding why it had been so easy. I went through the motions with my boyfriend like nothing had changed, though everything had. Our conversations remained as shallow as ever, check-ins that felt more like calendar reminders than genuine concern. When he asked how I was doing, I answered the same way I always did, my lies smooth and practiced now. And he never pressed, never looked closely enough to notice the cracks. But my body betrayed me. Each time he reached for me, each time his hand brushed against my skin, I felt the absence of heat where there should have been connection. I felt how much of me had already drifted out of his reach, how much of me he had let slip away long before anyone else had touched me. The strangest part was how little he seemed to notice. I started catching myself looking for excuses to cross paths with my landlord. Taking the long way around the building, pausing at the mailbox a little too long, listening for the soft creak of his door opening somewhere nearby. I wasn't proud of it. But want doesn't ask for pride. It doesn't wait for permission. It was on a Thursday evening, one of those long, heavy afternoons where the sky hangs low and the air feels too thick to breathe, that I saw him again. I was on my way back from another round of failed job hunting, my feet sore from walking too long in shoes that weren't meant for real effort, my head pounding with the familiar ache of disappointment. The weight of the day pressed hard against my shoulders, pulling my posture inward, making me small. He was outside, working on the garden near the front of the building. Simple maintenance, nothing unusual, but the sight of him there, steady, focused, quietly capable, struck something deep inside me. I should have kept walking. I should have nodded politely, kept my distance, pretended we were nothing more than landlord and tenant, but I didn't. I paused at the gate, my fingers tightening around the strap of my bag, watching him for a moment longer than I should have. He looked up, eyes catching mine, reading me too easily. "You look tired," he said. I offered a weak smile, the kind that barely reached my lips. "Long day," I replied. There was no invitation in his words, no suggestion. But the space between us filled with the same charged quiet I had come to recognize, the kind that waits, the kind that offers without asking. I didn't plan to follow him inside. I didn't tell myself it would happen again. But when he stood, wiping his hands on a rag and gesturing toward the door, my feet moved before my mind caught up. The apartment was cool and dim, the lights low, the same faint scent of cedar and coffee hanging in the air. I stood near the entrance, unsure whether to stay or turn back. "I can make you tea if you want," he offered, his voice soft. I nodded, though I knew it wasn't tea I needed. I watched him move through the kitchen, steady, deliberate. There was something unbearable about how normal it all felt. The easy rhythm of small domestic gestures, the quiet care in the way he filled the kettle, the way he waited for it to boil. When he handed me the cup, our fingers brushed, and the small accidental contact lit a spark beneath my skin. I felt my breath catch, my heart thudding too loud in the silence. We didn't speak for a while after that. The quiet stretched long and thick between us, and I could feel the weight of it pressing down on my chest. "I should go," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. He nodded slowly, setting down his own cup, stepping closer but still giving me space to leave if I wanted to. His eyes stayed on mine, steady as ever. "I know," he said simply. But I didn't move. Instead, I closed the distance myself. Again, my hand reaching for his, my body leaning into the gravity that had been pulling me toward him from the start. The kiss came softer this time, but no less certain. My lips finding his like they already knew the way. His hands rose, one brushing lightly against my cheek, the other settling at the small of my back, grounding me in the moment I had tried so hard to resist. I melted into the touch, into the heat of him, into the space where guilt and desire collided so sharply I could no longer tell one from the other. When we finally parted, the room felt too quiet, too still. "I can't keep doing this," I whispered. But even as the words left my mouth, I knew they were hollow. Because the truth was, I didn't want to stop. Not yet.